My uncle left his entire fortune to whoever could solve his riddle, so our family turned savage. Uncle Garrett was the black sheep who'd made millions in tech before anyone knew what cryptocurrency was. While the rest of us scraped by working dead-end jobs and maxing out credit cards, he lived in a sprawling mansion with 7 bedrooms, a wine cellar worth more than most people's houses, and a garage full of cars that cost more than my annual salary. When he died suddenly at 52 from a heart attack, we all secretly expected his fortune to go to some obscure charity. His final middle finger to the family who'd treated him like a pariah for decades. Instead, his lawyer called us all to his office and read the strangest will any of us had ever heard. To my greedy relatives who only called when they needed money or wanted to complain about their pathetic lives, I'm giving you one chance to prove you're worth more than the sum of your failures. Solve my riddle, claim everything I've built, fail, and it all burns in a magnificent bonfire while you watch from the street. The riddle was printed on expensive letterhead, sealed in individual envelopes for each family member. Where shadows dance but cast no light, where silence screams throughout the night, where memory lives but time stands still, find the key to my last will. At first, we actually worked together like a real family. My Aunt Patricia suggested his old photography darkroom, where he'd spent countless hours developing pictures. Cousin Dylan thought it meant his study, where he'd sit for hours in complete darkness, typing away on his computer. Mom was convinced it referenced the basement wine cellar, where he stored bottles worth thousands of dollars each. My brother Finn thought it meant the attic where old furniture gathered dust under white sheets. For 3 weeks, we tore through every inch of his mansion like a pack of wild animals. We moved furniture that hadn't been touched in years, checked behind expensive paintings for hidden safes, pulled up Persian rugs and pried at floorboards until our fingers bled. We searched crawl spaces, examined every book in his library for hollow compartments, and even had his pool drained to check for underwater hiding spots. Nothing. Not a single clue. That's when the family bonds started snapping like overstretched rubber bands. Patricia hired a private investigator who charged $800 a day. Dylan bribed the longtime housekeeper with a $1,000 tip for information about Garrett's daily habits and secret hiding places. Mom started showing up at the mansion at 5 in the morning to search rooms before anyone else arrived, claiming she needed the quiet to think clearly. Finn installed hidden cameras throughout the house to spy on the rest of us, monitoring our movements like we were common criminals. The real ugliness began when Patricia found something she wasn't supposed to find. She was searching Garrett's master bedroom for the 100th time when she discovered a loose floorboard hidden under his massive antique bed. Beneath it was a metal lockbox containing old photographs and what appeared to be a second riddle written in Garrett's distinctive handwriting. But instead of calling the rest of us immediately like we'd all agreed to do, she slipped it into her designer purse and pretended she'd found nothing. Unfortunately for Patricia, Finn's surveillance cameras caught everything in perfect high-definition detail. The next morning, he confronted her in front of the whole family gathered in Garrett's kitchen. Patricia denied stealing anything until Finn played the footage on his laptop, and we all watched her face go from confident to guilty to desperate in the span of 30 seconds. "Give it back right now," Mom demanded, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "I found it fair and square," Patricia shot back. "Possession is 9/10 of the law." That's when Dylan completely lost control and grabbed her $1,000 purse, dumping everything onto the marble kitchen floor. The metal box crashed open with a sound like breaking bones, scattering photographs and papers everywhere. There were ancient Polaroids of places I didn't immediately recognize, a tarnished key that looked like it belonged to something important, and a handwritten note that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "Only one of you actually deserves this fortune. The rest of you deserve what's coming to you." The note wasn't signed, but I recognized Garrett's handwriting immediately. The same careful script we'd seen on birthday cards that always came with crisp $100 bills, his way of buying our temporary affection without actually investing time in building real relationships with any of us. The scattered photographs showed places from our shared childhood that I hadn't thought about in years. The old family lake house where we'd spent summers before Grandpa died and left it to rot. Garrett's first dingy apartment above the pizza shop where he'd lived while teaching himself computer programming. The sketchy carnival where he'd worked summers during high school, operating the tilt-a-whirl for drunk teenagers and saving every penny for college. But one particular photograph made Patricia gasp so loudly that we all turned to stare at her. It showed the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town where our grandfather used to take us kids to play elaborate games of hide-and-seek. "He wouldn't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Wouldn't what?" Finn demanded, grabbing the photo from her trembling hands. Patricia looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Grandpa used to tell us horror stories in that warehouse during thunderstorms. Garrett was absolutely terrified of the place after what happened there. He swore on our mother's grave that he'd never set foot in that building again." Dylan picked up the tarnished key from the floor, turning it over in his calloused hands and examining the scratches along its surface. "This isn't for any safety deposit box I've ever seen. Look at these wear marks. This key's been used recently and often." The warehouse was exactly 43 minutes outside town according to my GPS, sitting on 15 acres of worthless swampland that had been in our family for 3 generations. We'd all crammed into Finn's oversized SUV like we were kids again, but the tension was so thick I could barely breathe. Nobody spoke during the entire drive except to give directions, but I caught Mom constantly checking her phone, probably texting her latest boyfriend Randy about the potential inheritance and what it would mean for their upcoming wedding. When we finally arrived, the warehouse looked exactly like I remembered from childhood visits: rusted metal siding that had turned orange-brown from decades of weather, broken windows that had never been repaired, and that distinctive smell of decay and stagnant water that seemed to cling to everything within a quarter-mile radius. The only thing different was the heavy-duty padlock on the front door, which looked expensive and recently installed. Dylan's key fit the lock perfectly, turning with a satisfying click that echoed across the empty parking lot. Inside, our flashlights revealed something that should have been impossible. The warehouse had been completely renovated from top to bottom. The concrete floors were spotless and painted a clean white. The walls had been insulated and covered with fresh drywall. Professional lighting fixtures hung from the exposed ceiling beams. And there, positioned in the exact center of the cavernous space, sat an antique wooden table with 5 chairs arranged in a perfect circle. On each chair sat a manila envelope with our names written in Garrett's careful handwriting. "This is absolutely insane," Finn muttered under his breath, but he was already walking toward his designated chair like he was hypnotized. My envelope contained another riddle, but this one felt different, more personal and menacing. "Before you stands your final test, one truth will put your greed to rest. Choose wisely what you value most, or join me as a warning ghost." Beneath the riddle was a typed confession that made my stomach turn, and my hands shake so violently I could barely hold the paper steady. When we were kids, maybe 15 years ago, Garrett had been watching us play an elaborate game of hide-and-seek in this exact warehouse when a section of the rotted floor suddenly collapsed without warning. Dylan, who was only 8 at the time, had fallen through the hole and landed hard on a pile of rusted machinery in the basement. His leg was broken so badly that jagged bone pierced through the skin, and blood was pooling around him at an alarming rate. The rest of us kids had panicked and run screaming for the adults, but Garrett, who was 13 and already bigger than most teenagers, had stayed behind and climbed down into that dark basement. He'd used his favorite shirt to create a tourniquet, applying pressure to the wound and talking calmly to Dylan to keep him conscious until the paramedics arrived 20 minutes later. According to the emergency room doctor, Dylan would have bled to death without immediate intervention. But that's not the story our family had been telling for the past 15 years. Patricia, who was 14 at the time and already showing signs of the jealousy and manipulation that would define her adult personality, had convinced our parents and everyone else that Garrett had actually caused the accident. She claimed he'd been daring Dylan to jump across the weak section of floor, egging him on and calling him a coward when he hesitated. She'd been furious that summer because Garrett always got the most attention from the adults. He was smart, funny, and charming in a way that made everyone gravitate toward him at family gatherings. Patricia had always been average at everything. Average grades, average looks, average personality, and she couldn't stand being overshadowed by her younger cousin. So she'd lied, crafting a detailed story about Garrett's reckless behavior and coaching the younger kids on what to say when the adults asked questions. Our parents believed her because Garrett already had a reputation as the family troublemaker, not because he was actually bad, but because he questioned authority and refused to pretend everything was perfect when it clearly wasn't. He'd spent the next 15 years being treated like a dangerous criminal for saving Dylan's life. I looked around the table at my family members, watching their faces as they read their own versions of the truth. Dylan was staring at his envelope with growing horror, his mouth hanging open as memories from that day began surfacing. Mom had gone completely pale and was gripping her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Finn looked confused and overwhelmed. He'd been too young to remember the incident clearly, but old enough to absorb the family narrative about Garrett being dangerous. Patricia was crying silently, mascara streaming down her cheeks in black rivers. "I was just a kid," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I didn't understand what it would mean. I didn't know it would follow him for the rest of his life." "You destroyed his relationship with our parents," Dylan said quietly, his voice filled with a pain I'd never heard before. He tried to tell them the truth, begged them to listen, but they'd already decided he was lying. They chose to believe you instead of investigating what actually happened. That's when I noticed the cameras. 4 professional-grade security cameras positioned in each corner of the warehouse, their small red recording lights blinking steadily in the shadows. We were being filmed and had been since the moment we walked through the door. A voice suddenly echoed from hidden speakers mounted throughout the building, Garrett's voice, but the recording was obviously recent, probably made just days before his death. "If you're hearing this message, you've successfully solved my riddle and learned the truth about what really happened in this warehouse 15 years ago. Congratulations on finally deciding to face reality. You've also just confessed your crimes on camera in front of multiple witnesses." Patricia looked up at the nearest camera with tear-filled eyes, her carefully applied makeup now completely ruined. "Garrett, please, I'm sorry. I was young and stupid and jealous, but I never meant—" "Patricia," the recording continued, and I could hear the cold fury in my uncle's voice even through the speakers. "You stole 15 years of family relationships from me with your lie. You cost me my parents' trust, my siblings' love, and any chance of having a normal relationship with the people who should have mattered most. That betrayal is worth exactly $15 million. Multiple screens mounted on the walls suddenly lit up, displaying legal documents in Garrett's distinctive filing system. Patricia's name appeared as the sole beneficiary of his primary estate, but there were conditions listed in small print that made her face go even whiter. "The money comes with strings attached, dear cousin. You have exactly 1 year to publicly confess your lie to every person you told it to, starting with our parents' graves. You'll establish a foundation for falsely accused children, and you'll spend the rest of your life trying to undo the damage you caused. Fail to meet any of these conditions, and the money goes to charity while your confession video gets uploaded to every social media platform on Earth. Finn jumped up so violently that his chair toppled backward and crashed to the floor. This is complete bullshit. Patricia lied, not the rest of us. Why should we be punished for something she did? But you never questioned it, did you? The recording replied, as if Garrett had anticipated this exact reaction and prepared a response. 17 years have passed, and none of you ever bothered to ask Dylan what he actually remembered from that day. You just accepted that your brother was a monster because it was easier than admitting you might have been wrong. Dylan's envelope contained different documents entirely. A trust fund worth $2 million, but also a letter that made him break down sobbing. Dylan. Garrett's voice became softer, filled with the warmth I remembered from our childhood. I'm sorry I never had the courage to tell you the truth while I was alive. You deserve to know that someone fought for you that day. You deserve to know that you were worth saving, and that I never regretted staying behind to help you. I hope this money can buy you some of the therapy our family should have provided years ago. Mom's envelope was nearly empty, except for a single devastating sentence written on expensive letterhead. A mother who doesn't defend all her children equally doesn't deserve wealth or forgiveness. Finn's envelope contained a check for $50,000 and a note that was somehow both generous and brutal. You were 5 years old when this happened, so you're not responsible for the lie. But you're 22 now, old enough to think for yourself instead of blindly accepting family mythology. This money is for college. Learn to question everything, especially stories that make one person a hero and another person a villain. My envelope held the biggest shock of all. My dear niece, Garrett's voice continued from the speakers. You never believed Patricia's lie, did you? Not completely. He was absolutely right, and the accuracy of his observation made my skin crawl. I'd been 7 years old that day, but old enough to remember Garrett's bloody shirt and how gentle he'd been with Dylan while we waited for the ambulance. I'd also been old enough to notice the inconsistencies in Patricia's story when she told it to the adults later. I watched you struggle with that secret for years during family gatherings. I saw how it ate at you, especially during holiday dinners when someone would inevitably bring up the warehouse incident and paint me as the villain. You tried to tell your mother the truth once when you were 12, but she shushed you and told you not to contradict Patricia. My envelope contained legal documents making me the executor of a separate trust fund, $3 million designated specifically for truth-tellers who find their courage too late but still choose to do the right thing. The cameras recording this conversation will automatically upload the footage to every family member's social media accounts in exactly 1 hour, Garrett's voice announced with mechanical precision. The video will be tagged with everyone's real names and employers. Unless someone takes full responsibility for what really happened that day, your confessions will become public knowledge. Patricia looked around the table desperately, her eyes wild with panic. I'll tell everyone the truth. I'll post on Facebook. I'll call everyone we know. I'll fix this somehow. 17 years too late, Dylan said quietly, but there was something like forgiveness in his voice. That's when Mom surprised us all by doing something I'd never seen her do in my entire life. She took responsibility for her own failures. No, she said, standing up slowly and walking to the center of the room. I need to take responsibility too. She positioned herself directly in front of the largest camera and looked straight into the lens with more dignity than I'd ever seen her possess. My name is Rebecca Thorne, and I failed my son in the worst possible way. When Patricia told us that Garrett caused Dylan's accident, I should have investigated further. I should have asked more questions. I should have listened to Garrett's side of the story with an open mind, instead of immediately assuming he was lying. Her voice broke, but she continued. Instead, I chose the easy story. I chose to believe that one of my sons was a hero who tried to help, and the other was a dangerous troublemaker who couldn't be trusted. I chose convenience over truth, and Garrett paid the price for my failure as a mother for the rest of his short life. The recording stopped abruptly. The cameras shut off with audible clicks. For several long minutes, the warehouse was completely silent except for the sound of Patricia's muffled sobbing and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Then Finn started laughing. Not the sound of humor, but the kind of bitter, hollow laughter that comes when someone realizes their entire life has been built on lies and false assumptions. So what happens now? He asked, his voice cracking. Do we all just pretend this never happened and go back to our miserable lives? No, Dylan said firmly, standing up with more strength than I'd seen from him in years. Now we do what Garrett actually wanted us to do. We tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. We stop protecting people who don't deserve protection. We start being the family he deserved to have. 6 months later, Patricia had used her inheritance to establish the Garrett Thorne Foundation for wrongly accused children, providing legal aid and counseling services for kids who'd been blamed for things they didn't do. The foundation's first major case involved a teenage boy who'd been expelled from school based on false accusations from a jealous classmate. Patricia saw herself in both the accuser and the accused, and fought harder for justice than anyone expected. Dylan donated his entire trust fund to expand the foundation's reach, saying that money couldn't buy back his lost relationship with Garrett, but it might prevent other families from making the same mistakes. He also started therapy and began speaking publicly about the long-term effects of childhood trauma and family scapegoating. Mom used her savings to commission a memorial garden in Garrett's honor at the local hospital where Dylan had been treated. She spent her retirement volunteering there, reading to children in the emergency room and advocating for better communication between medical staff and families during crises. Finn used his college money to study criminal justice and psychology, saying he wanted to help other people who'd been falsely accused of crimes or family dysfunction. He wrote his senior thesis on the psychology of family scapegoating and how seemingly small lies can destroy relationships for generations. I kept my inheritance, but not for personal gain. Garrett's final document had been very specific about the conditions. The money came with the responsibility to spend my life telling true stories about families who'd learned to do better, to expose the kinds of toxic dynamics that had nearly destroyed our own family. That's why I'm sharing this story with you now, as publicly and honestly as possible. But the story doesn't end there. Last week, exactly 1 year after Garrett's death, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Seattle that I'd never heard of. Another uncle I'd never known existed, Garrett's half-brother from our grandfather's first marriage, had died and left very specific instructions for his will to be read only if I was present as a witness. The lawyer, a stern woman in her 60s, handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in handwriting that looked eerily similar to Garrett's. Inside was a photograph of Garrett and this mysterious uncle standing together and smiling in front of a building I didn't recognize. On the back, someone had written in careful script, "Some family secrets run deeper than others." The real riddle was never about money. It was about whether your generation would choose truth over comfort when it really mattered. Below that message was an address in Montana and another old-fashioned key, this one made of brass and worn smooth from decades of use. The lawyer explained that this uncle, whose name was Thomas, had been watching our family drama unfold from a distance for years. He'd known about Patricia's lie, about our parents' failure to investigate, and about Garrett's years of isolation and pain. He'd also left me an inheritance, but only if I agreed to continue what Garrett had started. Thomas believed that some family traditions are worth breaking, the lawyer said, but others are worth starting. I drove to Montana the next morning, my car loaded with camping gear and enough supplies for a week. The address led me to a remote property outside Bozeman, surrounded by mountains that stretched endlessly in every direction. The main house was a sprawling log cabin that looked like it had been built in the 1920s, with additions added over the decades as the family grew and prospered. The brass key opened the front door easily, and I stepped into what felt like a museum of family history that I'd never known existed. The walls were covered with photographs spanning nearly a century, pictures of relatives I'd never met, family gatherings that predated my birth, and dozens of images of Garrett at various ages. But these weren't the formal portraits we had at home. These were candid shots of him laughing, working on computers, talking animatedly with an older man who had to be Thomas. In the center of the main room sat another table, this one carved from a single piece of oak and polished to a mirror shine. On it was a leather-bound journal and a note in Thomas's handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means you chose truth over comfort when it mattered most. Garrett told me about your family's dynamics years ago. He also told me about you, how you were the only one who ever questioned Patricia's story, even as a child. He believed you had the strength to break the cycle." I opened the journal and found pages upon pages of family history that no one had ever shared with us. Thomas had been documenting our family's patterns of dysfunction for decades, tracking how lies and manipulation had been passed down through generations like genetic diseases. Our grandfather, the man we'd all remembered as a loving patriarch who told stories and took us on adventures, had actually been an alcoholic who'd abandoned his first wife and son when Thomas was only 3 years old. He'd reinvented himself completely, marrying our grandmother and creating a new family while pretending his previous life had never existed. The pattern repeated with our parents' generation. Our father had covered up a hit-and-run accident in college, letting an innocent classmate take the blame and serve 2 years in prison. Our mother had stolen money from her employer to pay for our house, then manipulated the company's accounting system to frame a coworker for the theft. Garrett had discovered these secrets during his teenage years while helping our father with computer problems. He'd found hidden files containing evidence of both crimes, along with documentation showing how our parents had systematically destroyed the lives of innocent people to protect themselves. That's when everything about our family dynamics started making sense to me. Garrett hadn't been the family troublemaker because he was inherently bad. He'd been asking uncomfortable questions because he'd learned that our entire family foundation was built on lies and betrayal. Our parents had treated him like a threat because he represented the possibility that their carefully constructed facades might crumble. When Patricia lied about the warehouse incident, it gave them the perfect excuse to discredit him completely. They could dismiss anything he said about their past crimes as the ramblings of a dangerous child who couldn't be trusted. Thomas's journal contained copies of legal documents proving every allegation, police reports, court transcripts, medical records, employment files, all meticulously organized and verified. He'd spent decades building an airtight case against our parents and grandparents, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth, but he'd never acted on the information. "I was a coward," his final entry read. "I had the power to clear innocent people's names and bring justice to the victims of my family's crimes. Instead, I chose silence because confronting the truth would have meant losing the only family I had left, even if that family was built on foundations of lies." At the bottom of the journal was a phone number and an instruction. "Call this number if you're ready to finish what I should have started." I dialed the number with trembling hands. A woman answered on the first ring. "Ms. Thorne, I've been expecting your call. My name is Detective Rodriguez. I worked the case your Uncle Thomas contacted us about 15 years ago. She explained that Thomas had approached the police with his evidence shortly after Garrett's warehouse incident, hoping to provide context for the family dynamics that had led to Patricia's lie. But the statute of limitations had expired on both of our parents' crimes, making prosecution impossible. However, Detective Rodriguez continued, the victims are still alive. The man who served time for your father's hit-and-run accident is now 63 and living in Oregon. The woman who was fired and prosecuted for your mother's embezzlement is 58 and struggling to make ends meet in a nursing home she can't afford. She gave me their contact information and Thomas's final request. Use Garrett's foundation and my inheritance to provide restitution to the people our family had wronged. The conversations were the hardest I'd ever had in my life. Martin Espinoza, the man who'd served 2 years for our father's hit and run, cried when I called to explain what had really happened. He'd lost his scholarship, his fiancée, and his entire future because of a crime he didn't commit. He'd spent 40 years carrying the shame of something our father had done. I always wondered why your father was so kind to me after the trial, he said. He visited me in prison twice, brought me books, told me he was praying for my rehabilitation. I thought he was just a good Christian man trying to help a criminal find redemption. Our father had been visiting his victim to manage his own guilt, not out of genuine compassion. Louise Chen, the woman our mother had framed for embezzlement, had lost her career in accounting and never worked in finance again. She'd spent her savings on legal fees trying to prove her innocence, then worked minimum wage jobs for the rest of her life because no one would hire her with a criminal record. Your mother sent me a Christmas card every year for 20 years, Louise told me. She'd write little notes about how she was praying for my family and hoping I was finding peace. I kept them because I thought they meant someone still believed I was a good person. Our mother had been sending Christmas cards to the woman whose life she'd destroyed. Using Thomas's documentation and the foundation's legal team, we were able to provide full restitution to both victims. Martin received enough money to buy a house and secure his retirement. Louise's criminal record was expunged, and she received compensation that covered her lost wages and pension contributions over 4 decades. But the most difficult part was yet to come. Thomas had left specific instructions for handling our parents' reactions to the revelations. They were both still alive, though our father was in early-stage dementia, and our mother was living in an assisted care facility after a stroke. I drove to the care facility with copies of all the evidence, knowing this conversation would destroy what little remained of our family relationships. Mom was sitting in her wheelchair by the window when I arrived, staring out at the garden with the blank expression that had become her default since the stroke. Her speech was limited, but her mind was still sharp enough to understand what I was showing her. I spread the documents across the table in front of her and watched her face change as she recognized her own handwriting on the forged accounting records. Martin, Louise, she whispered, the only 2 words she managed to speak during our entire conversation. I explained how Thomas had documented everything, how the victims had suffered for decades, and how we were using Garrett's foundation to provide restitution. I told her about the Christmas cards she'd sent to Louise, and how they'd been received by a woman who had no idea why her life had been destroyed. Mom started crying, not the gentle tears of an elderly woman, but the raw, devastating sobs of someone whose entire sense of self was crumbling. When I was finished explaining everything, she pulled a notebook from her bedside table and wrote a single sentence with her shaking left hand. Tell them I'm sorry. I left the care facility and drove straight to our father's memory care unit. Dad was in the common room, working on a jigsaw puzzle that he'd been assembling and disassembling for weeks without remembering that he'd done it before. When I showed him the police reports from his hit-and-run accident, something flickered in his eyes, a moment of clarity that pierced through the fog of dementia. Martin was a good kid, he said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been in months. He didn't deserve what happened to him. For just a few minutes, my father remembered everything. He told me about the night of the accident, how he'd been drunk and driving home from a party when he'd hit Martin's bicycle. He'd panicked and driven away, then come back hours later pretending to be a witness who'd found the scene. I knew he was innocent, Dad said. I watched them arrest him and I said nothing. I visited him in prison because I thought if I was kind to him, somehow that would make it less evil. The clarity faded as quickly as it had come, and Dad went back to his puzzle, forgetting our conversation entirely. But I'd gotten what I came for. Confirmation that Thomas's evidence was accurate, an acknowledgement that our parents had knowingly destroyed innocent lives. Over the next 6 months, I worked with the Foundation's legal team to contact every person our family had ever wronged. Thomas's journal contained references to dozens of smaller incidents, co-workers who'd been fired based on false accusations, classmates who'd been bullied into silence, neighbors who'd been isolated and ostracized for questioning our family's version of events. Each conversation was like performing surgery on my own soul, cutting away pieces of the identity I'd built around being part of a good family. But each conversation also brought healing to people who'd carried undeserved shame for decades. The most surprising call came from Patricia herself. I found something in Garrett's house, she said, her voice barely audible, hidden in his bedroom wall. I think you need to see it. I drove to Garrett's mansion, which Patricia had been slowly cleaning out as part of her foundation work. She led me to his bedroom, where she'd discovered a hidden compartment behind his headboard. Inside was a collection of letters, dozens of them, all addressed to our family members but never sent. I wrote these over the years when I couldn't sleep, one letter to me began. I wanted you to know that I saw you trying to tell the truth when you were 12. I saw how Mom silenced you, and I wanted to tell you that I knew you believed me. But I was afraid that acknowledging it would put you in the same position I was in, isolated and blamed for things you didn't do. The letters to Dylan were filled with medical advice and emotional support that Garrett had researched but never shared. "I've been following your physical therapy progress through Mom's Facebook posts," one read. "I found some experimental treatments that might help with your chronic pain, but I didn't know how to contact you without causing more family drama." The most devastating letters were the ones addressed to our parents. "I forgive you for choosing to believe Patricia's lie," he'd written to Mom. "I understand that admitting you were wrong would have meant confronting your own capacity for poor judgment, but I need you to know that your choice to believe I was dangerous meant I grew up thinking I actually was dangerous. I spent 15 years afraid of my own capacity for violence because the people who should have known me best told me I was capable of hurting children." To Dad, "I know about the hit-and-run accident and Mom's embezzlement. Uncle Thomas told me everything when I turned 18. I've spent my entire adult life wondering if I inherited your capacity for destroying innocent lives, or if I could choose to be different. I chose to be different, but that choice cost me my family." The final letter, dated just a week before his death, was addressed to all of us. "I'm dying of a heart condition that probably could have been treated if I'd had a family support system encouraging me to seek medical care earlier. But I was so used to being seen as the family problem that I ignored my symptoms until it was too late. I don't blame you for my death, but I want you to understand that isolation kills people just as surely as any disease. I've set up the riddle and the warehouse revelation not to punish you, but to give you a chance to choose truth over comfort. If you're reading this letter, it means you made the right choice. It means the next generation of our family might actually have a chance to be healthy. The foundation isn't about my legacy. It's about giving other falsely accused children the support system I never had. It's about breaking the cycle of lies and manipulation that has defined our family for 4 generations. Thomas has more information about our family history. He's been too afraid to share it while he's alive, but he's left everything to you, my dear niece, because he believes you have the strength to handle the truth. Some stories are meant to end. Others are meant to transform into something better. I love you all, even though I couldn't figure out how to maintain relationships with you while also maintaining my integrity. Choose better for your children." Patricia and I cried together in Garrett's empty bedroom, mourning not just his death, but the relationship we could have had if our family had chosen truth over convenience decades ago. 2 weeks later, Thomas's lawyer contacted me with information about a final request. Thomas had purchased property in Montana specifically to establish a retreat center for families dealing with false accusations, scapegoating, and generational trauma. The buildings were already constructed. They just needed staff and programming. He wanted it to be called the Garrett Thorne Center for Family Truth, the lawyer explained. He hoped you'd consider running it. I moved to Montana 6 months ago. The center officially opened in January, offering week-long programs for families ready to confront their own patterns of dysfunction and deception. We provide therapy, mediation services, and legal advocacy for people trying to clear their names or repair relationships damaged by false accusations. Patricia visits every few months, bringing updates on the foundation's work and progress reports on the families we've helped. Dylan completed his psychology degree and joined our staff as a trauma counselor. Finn transferred to the University of Montana and helps with our legal advocacy program. Mom died peacefully in her sleep last winter. Her last words to the nursing staff were, "Tell Martin and Louise I'm sorry." We held a small memorial service and donated her remaining savings to the foundation. Dad's dementia has progressed to the point where he no longer recognizes any of us, but the memory care facility staff says he frequently talks about a boy named Martin and asks if anyone knows whether he's okay. The most recent development came just last month, when Detective Rodriguez called with news that shocked me. "We've had a breakthrough in the Louise Chen case," she said. "Your mother's former employer has agreed to issue a public apology and provide additional compensation. Apparently, your foundation's work has inspired other companies to review their old files for cases where employees might have been wrongly terminated." She paused. "There's more. We've identified 17 other cases from the same time period where the real perpetrator was protected while innocent employees were blamed. Your family's pattern of framing others wasn't unique. It was part of a broader culture of corruption at that company." Louise Chen, now 71, has become a volunteer advocate for our center. She helps other elderly people who are trying to clear their names after decades of carrying undeserved shame. Martin Espinoza, now 65, used his restitution money to establish a scholarship fund for formerly incarcerated people trying to rebuild their lives. He calls it the Second Chance Foundation, and he visits our center annually to speak with families about the long-term effects of false accusations. "The hardest part wasn't the prison time," he tells our guests. "It was the 40 years afterward. Always wondering if people could see the criminal record when they looked at me. Always feeling like I had to work twice as hard to prove I was worthy of basic human dignity." Both Martin and Louise have said that learning the truth about what happened to them, even decades later, was more healing than any therapy or compensation we could provide. Last week, I received another mysterious envelope, this time delivered by hand to the center's front desk. Inside was a photograph of a young girl I didn't recognize, standing in front of a house that looked familiar but which I couldn't quite place. On the back was written, "Garrett had a daughter. Her name is Emma. She's 22 now, and she's been waiting her entire life to meet her family. She's also been waiting for someone to tell her the truth about why her father never contacted her." Below that was an address in Portland and a phone number. "I'm driving to Portland tomorrow morning. Some family stories never really end. They just reveal new chapters when you're finally ready to handle the truth." Emma answered the phone on the first ring. as if she'd been waiting by it for years. "Is this about my father?" she asked before I could introduce myself. "Yes," I said. "I'm your cousin, and I have a lot to tell you. The cycle of secrets ends with my generation. The cycle of truth begins with hers.